Hey everybody, this is Jonathan Schrantz, and today I wanted to make a video on the Sicilian Najdorf. And I actually wanted to show you guys a way that you can play this as white. I know a lot of people, when it comes to the open Sicilian, they often have questions about how exactly they should respond to all sorts of different variations. A lot of people avoid the open Sicilian because of there's just so many variations that you do need to learn. But I do want to show you a recipe and encourage you guys to play the open Sicilian. I want to share with you guys a recipe for combating the Sicilian Najdorf. And my recommended line here in this position is actually the move bishop to e2. And this has a lot of good points, and a lot of it is psychological as well. When you play the move bishop to e2, you're kind of saying, maybe I'm not going to play as aggressive. Maybe I'm not playing bishop e3. Maybe I'm not going to play bishop to g5. However, I like bishop e2 with a sneaky idea. We're not going to play the main line here. We're going to play something really sharp, really aggressive. Try to put black on the back foot from move 1. When white normally plays bishop to e2, the normal idea is just to play safe. Your next move is to follow up with castles, maybe develop your bishop at some point, maybe play a4, very positional, very slow moves, fighting against b5, and maybe ultimately play king h1, play f4, kind of play in the center. And, if black has ever played moves like e5, move our knight back and just try to make it hard and fight for positional trumps. Like, we get the d5 square. These sorts of plans are going to be typical and what black is more or less expecting. However, black could play a lot of different structures here. Black could play a Scheveningen structure, for example, with the move e6. So we should know a little bit about that. They could play a Dragadorf with g6, kind of combining the Najdorf and the dragon, which is also an interesting way to play. But we will be focused today on the main line, which, in my experience, every Najdorf player plays the move e5. That's kind of why they're playing the Najdorf. And here is the beauty of my recommendation. We are going to be looking at 3 separate games today. I'm going to put all the games in the description below if you guys want to go and check them out one by one on your own. I'll also include the link to the study. So if you guys do want to go back, you want to see, this is on Lichess. If you want to go back, you want to check the Lichess study, do go below and there's going to be a link to the study. Now, my idea though, before we get into it, we're going to look at the moves bishop to e7 and bishop to e6. We're going to cover both of those in this little series here. But really quick, after bishop to e7, my idea is not to play the main move, which is just a castle, but to play a very clever waiting move. And the move that I'm going to recommend here is the move bishop to e3. And the whole point here is we're not castling kingside because we very well might want to castle queenside. And actually, in most of the lines, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're waiting to see if black wants to castle. And if they castle, which we're going to look at in our first game, our idea is to start an attack with the move g4. And we're going to kind of see it's very easy for white to get a big attack right out of the beginning of the game. Another idea is if they delay castling, if they want to play bishop to e7 or something, we still have ideas of potentially playing f4. And there's a lot more to cover, but with all that in mind, I do want to jump into our very first game here. And the first game that I do want to share with you guys is this game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura that was played in Tata Steel in 2017. I will shrink myself slightly so that it's a little bit easier to read the text above me, and we will, with that in mind, jump right into this game because it's very interesting here. Most players here actually prefer the move bishop to e6, which is also a semi-waiting move. So we waited with bishop to e3. Black can wait bishop e6, just playing a normal move, fighting for d5. And just taking it and waiting to see where white decides to castle and if white wants to do anything aggressive or not. However, it is interesting to note that Nakamura did decide to go for castling, so clearly he must believe that this is some good move, at least it's fine and acceptable. And white again might just play the move castles kingside. And, there's nothing wrong with it. You castle kingside, maybe you'll follow up later with f4 and have an okay game. However, Magnus goes right for g4, and this is the way that I like to play. It's so simple. You're just going to follow up with g5. You're going to play h4, and eventually at some point we're going to play f4, combining with the fact that white's just going to castle queenside, queen d2, castles, and have a very good game. So here, Naka decided to play bishop to e6, and white simply followed up with the normal move, which is pawn to g5. So here, the knight retreated, and queen d2 and h4 both seem to be very logical moves to me. And what's really nice about this is that it will be very easy for white to force something to open up on the king side. For example, once we play the move h5, we can simply play a move like g6 next, assuming black doesn't want to move the pawns, and he really doesn't. And you're going to force something to open up, so you're guaranteed to have some kind of attack here in the future. Here, Nakamura played knight to b6. Black's main plans include putting knights on the c4 square. Black understands queen d2 and castles is coming, so he's preparing to go here, which usually will force white to give up the bishop. Now, white does follow up with queen to d2, and Nakamura just simply develops the knight to d7. So here, obviously, castling queenside seems like a very logical move. Magnus, however, played this interesting move f4. So not yet committing to castling queenside, but playing f4 right away, which really does threaten just the positional move f5, which would not only force black to give up the bishop, like, I don't know, if he just totally passed, not only would he lose control over the d5 square, but also f6 in the future would be coming pretty quickly. So this essentially forces black to take on f4, which happens, and now bishop takes f4. So here, the pawn structure has changed, so every time the pawn structure changes, we want to have a look and see what's going on. We can now kind of understand why this knight went to d7. So from black's point of view, he needs to shield this d-pawn. White's going to castle and have 3 attackers on the d6 pawn, so black simply will be able to play a move like knight to e5, and it looks like a very pretty knight. There's no doubt about it. But another big plus is that we've actually, by removing this pawn on e5, we've created a square on d4. So this knight is almost always going to pivot to the d4 square, where it can end up going to f5, joining in for an attack. It's also worth pointing out that white, often this knight has a plan of going to d5, even if it means closing up this pawn structure, allowing this change in the pawn structure, because with this big thorn pawn here on d5, it's still going to be very easy to pivot around, and if black doesn't have the bishop, the f5 square will just be clear for the other knight. And these are just some of the basic battle plans. Black, on the other hand, will be trying to, blocking knight to e5, trying to put one of these knights, either one on c4, and try to find some tactics over here on the king side. The rook's coming to c8, the queen might go to c7, might go to a5, the pawn should be coming to b5. Black's going to need to try to get an attack here. However, it does just seem, just both from my experience and just from watching this game, white's attack does just seem to land first in a lot of cases. So it's really simple and easy to play. Knight e5 was Magnus's choice, and followed up with the move castles. And here, after the move rook to c8, also very logical, still waiting. It's actually funny to note how long Nakamura waited in this game before he actually puts a knight on c4, and it's also very interesting to see exactly what Magnus did here. Magnus's maneuver here, he actually slows down, he takes a few precautions. There's a lot of interesting tactics that sometimes happen over here on the king side, and his idea is actually king b1, king a1. Magnus is going to run his king all the way into the corner, and he starts with the move king to b1. And I've seen him do this maneuver, king b1, king a1, in a lot of different games. So he does it here against the Najdorf. I've seen him do it in games against the Dragon. He's done it in a game against... He did it in I think it was the Neo Grunfeld. Point is, he's done it a lot. He castles queenside, and he puts that king all the way over on a1, where it does defend against some of the tactics, which we'll get into in just a moment. Queen c7, and now the move h5 was played. So yeah, he showed a little bit of patience, and now he eventually will be playing h5, and probably g6 will be the best way to break into the black pawn structure here. Also interesting of note, Nakamura plays rook f to e8. Both these guys very patient. He's just creating a square for the bishop, and he's going to try to set up a little fortress and defend against some of the attacks that white is going to be throwing at him. And yeah, both these guys very, very patient, and we see it here again with the move king to a1. And one of the points is that whenever there's a knight on the c4 square, there's sometimes tactics. If your king is on b1, and if you can imagine in your head, one of the knights going to c4, possibly white will trade off one of the knights in one order or not. But from the square, there is sometimes ideas like knight to a3 and other weird tactics when the king is on b1, where if you took back with a pawn, it would move the defender of c3. So here, king to a1, bishop to f8, and now the move knight to d4. So this is one of the main knight maneuvers that white needs to keep in the back of his mind. Knight goes here, and most often it's just heading to that very nice f5 square. Queen to c5 was played, and now the move g6. Here, Nakamura finally puts one of his knights on c4, and we can kind of see, after we trade one of the knights, queen to d3. Black is looking around, and you have to be a little bit careful as white. You always want to try to take into account what your opponent is doing, but keeping the queen connected to the knight is a very good decision, because black is looking for tactics. Black is going to have to find something before white crashes through, so black's taking a look around. Okay, maybe this is a sacrifice. If the king was still on b1, then maybe knight to a3 is sometimes actually a nice tactical idea. Obviously, black might have slow ideas like b4, b5, but do you really have time for something like this? The onus will be on black to try to come up with something quick. I've also kind of spotted maybe queen to b4 could be one of the ideas, so white just needs to be a little bit careful and make sure you're kind of ready, peeking at your opponent's threats while you're also attacking them. Here, so we get the file to open up, and h6 is played, so temporarily closing the king side here. However, now white on every turn will be looking for, does the move bishop takes h6 work? As soon as you get this hook here, white is going to be looking to try to blow it up in one way or another. Queen to g3 was played. This seems to be a nice way to start, because now this pawn is ready to go to g7, so you can imagine in some line, if we sacrifice on h6 and the pawn moves, maybe g7 will get to come here. Now, after queen to b6, making a threat, so we got to be careful here, he just simply puts the bishop back on c1, defending against the threat, and white will keep going with an attack, and the sacrifice won't be able to do it for a little bit, but let's see how the game actually transpires here. After queen to a5, white just plays rook to f1, and yeah, after knight e5, knight d5, good way of clogging it up. And this is even a pawn sacrifice, but notice how now that there's no longer a threat on b2, after some captures and we sack the pawn, he's able to crash through on h6. And white's attack here is just simply way too strong, and Magnus went on to win this in very fine style. Very flawless conversion from here. Plays the move g7, and after bishop to e7, takes on h6. So yeah, really nice. You can tell white is broke through. Black does not have an attack. So all he can do is hope to defend. But here, another spectacular move. Yeah, feel free to pause at any point too. If you want to try to play like Magnus in these positions, feel free to pause here. But queen g6 is such a strong, powerful move. After this exchange, he takes back. The queen is threatening to come to h8. And yeah, gives up a bishop. But yeah, Magnus, of course, finds a very, very nice continuation here. So queen h8, making another queen. And after the captures, takes on f6. And yeah, after rook e1, Nakamura had to throw in the towel here. So a really, really nice model attack here by Magnus. I just want to kind of point out this approach. This seems like such a normal thing. I think most of the opponents are not going to pass with bishop to e6. The most natural move is to castle. I mean, why not just castle and you expect white to castle? But this g4 attack, where white, both players actually showed tremendous amounts of patience, does seem to work out very well. It's a very nice recipe for white, who eventually crashed through and won. Excellent game by the world champion. Okay, so let's... So for me, this variation kind of came onto the map when I saw Magnus Carlsen play it. A lot of the times I watch Magnus Carlsen games, and that's where I get a lot of inspirations for my own repertoire. Obviously, the guy's brilliant and comes up with a lot of great ideas in the opening. But I always have a very special place in my heart for any games played here in St. Louis. So one such game was played between Awonder, Liang and Caden Troff in the 2016 U.S. Junior Championships. So one of the more exciting tournaments whenever we get the kids here playing. Usually we get a lot of tactical openings and a lot of really fun chess. And in this game, I want to point out a slightly different plan that can happen all the time. So again, we get the move. We played bishop e2. After e5 was played, we're looking one more time at bishop to e7, and then we're going to come back and we're going to take a glance at bishop to e6 in our next game. But after bishop to e3, this is our patient waiting move. Bishop to e6 was played in this game by Caden. And this is an excellent move. Black is waiting, so there's actually quite a lot of moves that white can choose from here. White can, for example, castles, which is the main move. White can play knight to d5, which I do want to showcase in this game. But there's other moves as well. Queen to d3, f4, queen d2. There seems to be quite a lot of moves in this position. So really, black has to be ready for quite a bit more than black does. However, I like this move, knight to d5. And one of the reasons it always stands out in my mind is I did play a blitz game once against a FIDE master, and I played this line, and I won so smoothly with the plan that I'm going to illustrate for you guys today that he accused me of cheating. So in the back of my mind, it's like, in my mind, I'm always thinking, if you play this way, people might accuse you of cheating, because it's kind of weird. You're allowing black to change the pawn structure. Normally, white never wants to allow a capture here, for example, closing the d5 square so that you don't have this normal plan of preventing d5. You don't have the normal pressure against d6. But it is an excellent pawn structure, and I'm going to kind of explain the reason that I like it in just a moment. However, after knight to d5, the main point is that this pawn is simply not hanging. We have a queen and a bishop aimed up at the b6 square. So for example, if they do take on e4, you can just hit them with the move bishop to d6. Now, they're absolutely toast here. After knight to c8, you can play knight to c7. Obviously, we're going to grab that rook. We're going to misplace the king. And you can either grab this rook right away, or you can be kind of mean and just move this bishop somewhere and just let them know. The rook really can't go anywhere. Either way, this is just great for white. So instead, what normally happens is either knight takes d5, or what is actually the main move, knight b to d7. In either case, we are probably going to get a very similar pawn structure at some point. Black will relent and have to take on d5. For example, now that the e-pawn actually is attacked, most people are playing queen to d3, which is not such a bad square for the queen. And yeah, after castles, at some point, black will probably need to relent, and we're going to get the same pawn structure that we see in the game. Here, though, it is with a slightly different piece configuration, but you can imagine over the next couple moves, black's plan is going to be move the knight away and play f5. And as we're going to see, the normal plans for this pawn structure for white is whenever black eventually plays the move f5, to meet it with the move f4. And when we get there, we'll talk about the consequences of such a plan. The other idea for white is, since we have more space on the queen side, here's like the spearhead of our pawn chain, white is going to try to play the moves like c4 and eventually move the knight out of the way, play b4, c5, these kinds of pawn breaks. So we head back to the game. After knight to d5 in our featured game here, the move that was played was knight takes d5. And after the pawn takes back, the bishop had to move to f5, and we start to see the basic plans here. And one of the ways to get these pawns rolling is, okay, c4, that's kind of an easy free move. But another interesting way, we got to get this knight out of the way at some point. So one of the best ways to do that is queen to d2, knight to a5. So queen to d2 important, defending our knight. And after the knight's here on a5, where it also puts a lot of pressure on the pawn, we follow up with b4, potential moves like rook to c1. If needed, the knight can go back to b3. And white will eventually crash through with the move c5. And if you can contain everything that black's going to do, if black needs to play the move f5 to make any progress in this structure, it's going to require another bishop move, followed by, okay, presumably both sides are going to spend some time castling. But then after f5, we're going to meet it with f4 and try to stop any aggression by black. So queen d2 was played in this game. Castles, knight to d7. And now we see the typical plan by white, knight to a5, with the idea of following it up with c4 and b4. So queen c7 was played, attacks the c-pawn, but the c-pawn is going to c4 anyway. And now after bishop to g7, we see the move b4. So very logical play by both sides. And here black actually plays a rather slow move. We've seen this plan of rook to e8 in the Nakamura game. It does appear that people that play the Najdorf as black, they really like this maneuver, where you can put one of your pieces back on the f8 square. Possible was also to play the move f5, and I do want to spend this time, I think this is an even more popular move. Most people are going to play f5. And again, the idea by white is to meet this with the move f4. So let's actually take a moment real quick to discuss the possibilities here, because there's three things that black can do. Black can ignore and leave the tension, which does seem to make sense. In that case, white is going to need to just keep building pressure on trying to get the move c5 in. Probably rook c1, or eventually knight b3. Those kinds of moves would be very logical. First of all, though, let's look at what happens if they do take on f4. I think this is one of the most natural and most popular ways to handle this position. Well, now you'd simply take back, and we're already threatening the move c5. And I do want to give just one quick illustration of how white often can play the move c5 under tactical circumstances. So if black does nothing, we play c5, and this might end up being a disaster for black. So what players have done in the past here is they've played queen to b6 check, which has gotten out of this pin and defended against the threat of c5. However, now after knight to f6, we can play this move c5, which is a very tactical move, but very often, if you look at the white pieces and they're this active, you're going to be able to sacrifice to push this break through. After d6, also knight to c4 was probably another very strong move for white, but after d6 here, now knight to c4, things are going very well. Black is going to, if he wants to take this pawn, need to waste a little bit of time, and I do want to mention this move. Queen to d1, which actually threatens to trap the queen with rook to b1, for example. If here, we can already see some examples of the queen. Take a look around, not a lot of squares. If you go here, bishop to e5 will be a trapped queen there. So tons of activity and tons of active play. White is down a pawn, but all the activity will really favor him. D pawn is looking very nice. This bishop might be able to come to f3. Rooks are going to come in very quickly. And yeah, you have to be ready to sacrifice sometimes a pawn in these kinds of positions, but that's just one example of how things might end up. So heading back to if f5 had been played, again f4, and I just want to look at the move e4, which is usually one of the worst options, but a lot of players that you play against, they might end up doing it because it looks good at first sight. You play the move e4, you get a passed pawn after all, but it does really stifle black's structure. It's not so easy now for black to make any progress on the queen side. He's going to have to try to organize like h6, g5 potentially, and white is just going to be a lot quicker. So you'd love to see the move e4, where you have ideas of the knight coming all the way around b3 to d4, or potentially he can jump into the e6 square. Potentially, if the b pawn moves, you can jump into the c6 square. Rook c1 is also coming. And another way of actually getting pressure against these pawns is for white in the future to play the move g4. It's often a very normal idea for white to, in these kinds of positions, to play g4, which might look a little bit aggressive, but yeah, if you take this pawn, then the e-pawn will also become a weakness. So yeah, that's all very typical and normal for this opening. So with all that in mind, in our game after b4 was played, rook to e8 was played, and now rook to c1, getting on with life. And c5 is coming, so black decided to play this move b6. A little bit controversial, letting the knight hop in, but now we see the point of rook to f8, and that was to play the move bishop to f8. And here white made a very interesting and very good decision. So this was one of the moves that kind of surprised me, but I think it turns out to work out very well. And that move was bishop to d3, just trading off these bishops. This bishop ends up being pretty good, and we would love to see black shut it down. If black shuts it down, white just moves again and then just says, yeah, if you go here, it's not going to be so easy because I have knights hopping around. Probably here right away, because then you can't even move your bishop out of the way to defend this square. So if you force this pawn here, you might actually be forcing black into making a few concessions. Black actually doesn't want to get this pawn to e4 until he's absolutely ready to start running down with all of his pawns here. So yeah, very good play. Bishop to d3, which means we're going to be trading off these bishops. And now after knight to b8, we saw the capture and the move b5. So he's just solidifying that knight in there. Now obviously black is not going to capture, but I guess black was very happy in this position to shut down everything on the queen side. So yeah, it was a very interesting example. Black hasn't played all that bad. Both of these players have really followed through pretty well up until this point. However, now after f4, what ends up happening in the game, and again, you don't really want to play a move like e4, so he captured. It's white actually just has a little bit more space. It's nothing too horrible yet. It did work out really well for white in this game. But yeah, at some point here, it just became hard for black to defend. White now is going to crash through here, And in this position, so far everything has just been going normal according to plan. But here, white really should have grabbed this pawn. I guess it's hard when you're in these kinds of positions and you're in real life. You want to find moves that improve without having to responding to what your opponent wants. Perhaps he was worried after here there'd be a move like, rook to e8, putting pressure here. But white should be able to play a move like rook to h3 or possibly move this bishop somewhere and have a very good position a pawn up. Didn't happen in the game. White instead plays for some activity over here. And now, yeah, bishop d4 also was probably a mistake by white. There was better ways of trying to remove this defender of f6. But, yeah, we can see in a few more moves, eventually it gets very tactical very quickly. White makes it complicated, makes it tactical, gets the rook trapped, but there are going to be some tactics based on rook takes g6 coming up in the future here. And yeah, so after this exchange sack, white takes on g6. So kind of like I said, these guys, when they play in the junior champs, they do like to make it very tactical. And yeah, he found a way to get this king exposed. And after this capture, recapture, queen f4, here is where black ultimately made the final mistake that does cost him the game. You can pause and spend some time trying to figure it out for yourself. It's a very complicated endgame. Here he went to g6, which is actually a mistake. The only move that kept him in the game was king to h7. So yeah, you get this idea that it is very difficult to defend this kind of position as black. I don't want to go too much into it. This is mostly about the opening in this lecture. But here he managed to win this pawn with check and then followed it up with some pretty nice play. Queen to f4, queen f7, and here threatens mate. So after some checks, played an accurate move in this position, so I like this, not taking the bishop directly. King g2 is even more accurate, where black is just having a hard time defending against the mate threat. So, and when he finally does, white gets to play another beautiful move. So yeah, he's fought against the idea of the rook coming to h5, but now queen to e6 is the beautiful way to defend here. And yeah, I mean, take a look around. You're going to have to like block. If you go here, we're going to get to start making a ladder with the queen and the rook. So yeah, I had to defend this way. And certainly there should be and is a way for white to win this game here pretty quickly. Now white is going to be able to set up a ladder going this way. So I thought that was a very interesting game and I really liked it. And it was, of course, played in St. Louis. And I do want to focus just one last time on the main part here in this middle game. So again, we're looking at the lines with bishop to e7, but this time when black is patient, black didn't castle and allow g4 with a big attack. Black played bishop to e6, which does allow this very interesting option. Not the only option. You're certainly welcome to come up with something else if you don't like this pawn structure or you want to play this a little bit different as white. Certainly a lot more lines that you could be looked at, but I just love this idea of getting the pawn structure and then following it up with, yeah, queen d2. The knight goes to a5, c4, b4, and eventually, even though it didn't happen in this game, c5 could be played in a lot of positions. So, yeah, just an excellent example by these two guys. Very nice. And this last example that I do want to show you guys today is a game that I actually didn't know before I started preparing for this lecture today. But in our model position here, sometimes our opponents will play bishop to e6. So we're now taking a break from looking at bishop to e7 to see what happens if they play this move, bishop to e6. And as the game, Fridrik Olafsson versus Lubomir Kavalek from 1974 will illustrate, white again has excellent chances to get a huge attack. And the popular moves here in this position are, again, not what I'm going to recommend. People like to castle, people like putting their bishop on either e3 or g5. But I do want to point out that there's this other sharp possible continuation after the move f4. I do really like this move. It's a very aggressive move, and it hints at just playing the move f5 directly, and if white can get away with this, he's going to have a great position. So let's take a quick look around and kind of see what might happen. For example, if you just ignore it and you play bishop to e7, we're going to play f5, where you're going to have to put this bishop on sort of an awkward square like d7. This is probably the best move. But then moves like bishop to e3 and bishop to f3 and some move order will come. White will probably castle. Could castle either way. You can imagine just castling kingside and just saying, life is good. Or you can even castle queenside and just go for another attack. G4, G5 might be coming up the board pretty soon. Here, life should be pretty good for white. If instead they take here, this is probably the worst option. Giving away the light squared bishop really makes it very difficult to control the d5 square, which means black will never play d5, and white will probably be able to, at some point, make use of this d5 square, whether it's just putting direct pressure on the d6 pawn, or if it's eventually occupying it with a knight in the future. So heading back to here, the most common move is actually queen to c7, which kind of gives you this square for the bishop. So after bishop to c4, if there's a capture, you can take back with the queen. And if the opponents decide to take here, well, then simply we get to take back on f4. And here the bishop has got to f4 in just one move. We saw in the previous variations where we had to play bishop to e3 and only then after a capture take here. So this shouldn't bother us at all. It's the same sort of deal. We get pressure here. Queen d2 castles, and we already have this knight pivot all the way over to f5 in mind. Mixing that with g4, g5, h4, h5, these kinds of ideas will give white a very good game. So the proper way to handle this is with queen to c7. And if you don't know the main move here, feel free to pause here and see if you can figure out what the most popular move is. You might be thinking castles, you might be thinking f5, you might be thinking a4. These are all fine moves in this position, but the most aggressive move and the move that I really like is the move g4. And here we're even waiting, we're not even moving this bishop out yet. So yeah, g4. That was the move played in this game, and white in this game just got a truly fantastic attack. And this was played a long time ago, so black didn't know the best plan here. But black did end up taking on f4, and now just following it up with g5. Very strong move. The knight hops back, we take on f4, and white already has everything in this position. It's going to be quick development, queen d2, castles, followed up at some point h4. Mixing all these moves in the right order is going to give white just a huge attack here. Knight c6 was played, queen went to d2, and black here already made sort of a weird decision. Black is already in a lot of danger, but the move rook to d8 really didn't help the cause. And yeah, this only makes things worse for black. The main ideas would probably include, again, getting this knight to c4. This is what I think most players with black should be trying to do. Possibly by pivoting a knight on e5. So either one of these knights, potentially even this one. So if I were playing this with black, I think I would move this knight, which might look a little controversial because you might think, well, this guy, isn't he far back? Isn't this guy already on a normal square? But I think I would save this knight so that he also could go to the c4 square. Knight to b6, we saw Nakamura play it. It's a very typical maneuver for the knight. Yeah, those typical knight moves are probably the way to go. Try to get a knight to the c4 square. Also, black should be considering maybe rook to c8. This is typically the better square, where sometimes, when they castle queenside, there's these exchange sacrifices. Yeah, it's a long way off, but sometimes rook takes c3 will be a normal sacrifice for black in these opposite side castling Sicilian defenses. And also, b5. These are the kinds of moves I'd be thinking of as black. I guess it's worth also considering bishop e7, which just has the idea of castling, but maybe there really is something better than rook to d8. Here now, white decides to castle. Knight d to e5. Okay, not so bad. h4 comes, and black again makes a very dubious decision, plays the move g6. And I don't like this at all. White is attacking over there on the king side, so now it's easy. You just play the move h5 after bishop to g7. This was the obvious point. White can even consider h6. I don't think it's the best move, but h6, humiliating the bishop, is kind of another idea, getting that alpha 0 pawn on h6. But I love the way white played from here. Knight to d5. Yeah, okay, they close this, but changing this pawn structure, as we've seen, is often very good for white. After the knight retreated, he has some dreams of eventually coming to the c5 square. White played a great move here, rook to h3. And this move is great for many different reasons. We're going to be bringing another rook to the h-file, which will threaten to take on g6, where you won't be able to take back with the h-pawn. You'll have to take some other awkward way. And it also has the idea of swinging over. Maybe the queen will go to c3, pressure on the queen. Maybe the rook will be able to go to e3, with the same file as the king. So for a lot of different reasons, this is just a fantastic move, and it just builds the pressure. So that's why this is actually a lot better than a move like h6. You're just slowly building the pressure. And what is black going to do? If you castle, that looks like you're going to get destroyed. H-file is going to be open. So not so easy for black to make a very good move. Knight b to d7 was tried. And yeah, he simply puts all the rooks on the h-file and now is threatening to take here where you wouldn't be able to take back with your h-pawn, which would be the normal, natural way to do it. So look what happened to poor black here in this position. Had to play the move rook to g8. You hate to see it. Now the king is stranded in the middle forever. He's got the f8 square in the future, but not looking pretty. And Carlsening it up. He plays the move king to b1. Love it. And it's hard. How does black make a move? You just say, black, your turn, you make a move. Okay, knights are finally going to c4. Rook goes to the same file as the king. Very logical. King to f8, trying to get out of there. And now he makes use of the a5 square. Also interesting is the knight also was a very logical contender to go to that square. I do want to just point it out, not that it's the best in this position, but in these kinds of positions, this is often a good move. Not that it necessarily is here. But sometimes this knight on a5 does defend the c4 square. So I just want to point it out as a logical square for a knight in this kind of position. But yeah, this seems fine too. And he's just going to tie black down. He tries to defend his knight this way. Now the move h6, asking the bishop to move away, which is a good decision before this rook ever moves. So yeah, white just has everything here. You can't take this with a knight. The queen would be hanging. So yeah, he just gets all the normal moves in. c4, he's just going to be trying to blow up the position. A good way to do that would be to play the move c5. Things are different here. We're not getting a king-side attack, although the king is very stranded. Look at these poor pieces over here. But yeah, c4 is still very logical. And here there's a pin, so it looks very strong. So yeah, black tries to get rid of one of these pieces. White simply trades and plays the move rook to e3. And he's just all the time hinting at playing this move c5. Now there are some tactics here. So for example, you can't just grab this pawn because after we take back, again, now there's this same pin, so you won't be able to take with the knight. And if you take here, we take on b6. Things seem to be falling apart over here. You wouldn't want to play this way. So for that reason, rook to e8 was tried. But now the bishop goes back, and eventually white gets to play the move c5. And this is just a king hunt. The king really should not survive here. And in fact, white played an excellent game from this point. Basically, this whole game was excellently played by white, which is kind of why I wanted to show it. Here he takes. As long as we're opening up that king, we're going to be doing well. And not looking good. Not looking good. If you take with the queen, you're going to lose this guy. So you have to take with the king. And now a very good example of a nice attack. Getting all the pieces in, finding another diagonal for the bishop. King is just stranded, running all over the place, and rook to d1 will end up winning some material here. Just nothing you can do about it. So some material has fallen. Very nice little combination. And yeah, it didn't last much longer than this. There was a lot of good ways for white to win this, but the way he did it, I think, still holds up to computer testing. So yeah, an excellent model example. So I do want to point this out as one last possible way to play. If in this position they play bishop to e6, what you want to know is after f4, queen c7, the main line, this very nice move, g4. And when they take, first kick the knight away, pick the pawn back up, and you should get an excellent attack, especially if black doesn't follow through with any sort of attack whatsoever. So yeah, I hope you guys did enjoy it. I've had excellent success playing this way against the Najdorf, so hopefully you guys have picked up on some of the tricks. And do let me know if you like this way in the comments below. Do you guys play against the Najdorf? Is this the way to do it? Are there better ways? Let me know in the comments below. As always, please hit like, share this around, let other people know about it, and I will see you guys next time.